Hi, everyone.
Greetings. We're in the Proclaimer's book, page 29. In the last section, they got to the subject of organization and tried to make the point that the Jewish nation was a theocracy, a theocratic organization. And we showed the fallacy there, that it's not at all like the version of theocracy that you experience in the Watchtower. Mm-hmm. And it gets worse when you get into the New Testament and you have to invent the fiction of a governing body to read your organization structure back into the first century. Mm-hmm. And we saw the fallacies of that too, and they've actually made it worse in the last decade or so with this three-tier theocracy that used to be a two-tier theocracy. Mm-hmm. And now they're on the subject of identified by holy conduct and love. So this God's organization is identified clearly by holy conduct and love. Only 2 paragraphs here, but much to unpack. Mm-hmm. Here's the first paragraph. The testimony of the first century witnesses of Jehovah was not limited to the fruit of lips. Discipleship shaped the entire life of a Christian witness. Hence, not only did those Christians proclaim their beliefs, but their beliefs transformed their lives. They put away the old personality with its sinful practices and endeavored to clothe themselves with the new personality created according to God's will. They were truthful and honest, as well as hardworking and dependable. They were morally clean. Sexual immorality was strictly prohibited. So were drunkenness and idolatry. For good reason, then, Christianity became known as the way being capitalized here. A way or manner of life that centered around faith in Jesus, following closely in his footsteps.
One quality, though, stands out above all others: love. The early Christians demonstrated loving concern for the needs of fellow believers. They loved one another not as themselves, but more than themselves. They were willing even to die for one another. But this was not surprising. Was not Jesus willing to die for them? He could tell his disciples, "I am giving you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love among yourselves." Christ commanded that his followers show such self-sacrificing love, and this command his first century disciples closely observed.
Well, there's just a lot of things we can agree with here. That not only did those early Christians proclaim their beliefs, but their beliefs transformed their lives. Yes, they put away the old personality, and tried to, or they've used the verb endeavored to clothe themselves with the new personality. Great. They were truthful and honest. Yes, I'm pretty sure most of them were. But what's the problem with all these generalizations? They were truthful and honest. They were morally clean. And I like the fact that they've added immediately after that, sexual immorality was strictly prohibited. So were drunkenness and idolatry. But it brings to mind the problem here is that you get all this information about what they were like from the New Testament itself.
Which is books that are counseling against these things.
Yeah.
And talking about the problems that those individual churches might have had in those areas.
Yeah. So do we think about the fact when we're witnesses that most of the New Testament is composed of letters that are occasional letters written to real congregations in real spaces,
dealing with
problems that existed in those areas.
Yeah. So you think of Corinthians and the letters to the churches in Revelation.
Most of them had problems.
They had problems. They existed in them, and they were called churches, and yet they had problems that existed at the time.
Some of which, by the way, I would say all of which, the witnesses, the organization would not tolerate at all. So when they say strictly prohibited, what's the only evidence we have of a disfellowshipping? Well, it's in Corinth.
And it was very scandalous.
A public scandal.
Yeah.
We've talked about that in other videos.
Even the people of outside of the church did not live this immorally.
But in a church like Corinth, you have that list of make no mistake, it says don't kid yourselves. None of these people, and it lists who will not inherit God's kingdom. But we have no evidence that the people who were struggling with sexual sin, for instance, were being shunned
Yeah.
by the congregation. They were disciplined. They certainly weren't allowed to rise into positions of authority in the church, but the shunning, no. There's no evidence that the early church shunned people who were struggling with their
Transformation takes time. And the church allows for the time for people to be transformed.
So all four of the letters they reference here, Hebrews, Colossians, Ephesians, Galatians, if you read these letters closely, you realize there's some horrible things going on in these churches.
Just in a recent conversation with one of our groups, somebody described the church as a dysfunctional family. They were talking about modern church, but I would say the church throughout history, that's a good description. A dysfunctional family. So there's good examples and bad examples. There's obedient and disobedient. And yet in a family, that happens too. You don't throw the kid out because he's disobedient.
You don't?
No, you don't throw him out. You try and help them. You nurture them. You give them the right counsel. You show them what the Word says, the way of God, but you don't throw them out.
And that goes to the second paragraph here, this discussion of love being the outstanding characteristic of Jehovah's Witnesses today. Well, it should be, but we know as ex-witnesses that it's not unconditional love. It's not agape love we're talking about. Because the shunning policy itself proves that. I.e., we know for sure that in church history and in the New Testament, people who struggled with sin were not shunned. Certainly they weren't separated for life from their families.
Yeah.
But you brag about the fact that you've got the clean organization that shuns people or casts out people who don't comply with your moral
standards. But the truth is that these people who are disfellowshipped were witnesses when they were doing that. So the transformation didn't stick. And that happens. People know what's right and may fall into sin. But, that doesn't mean you cast them out. You try and help them past those problems.
Now, in the New Testament, it's very obvious, as they've said here, that the church was called the way. It was recognized as being different than the Roman Empire and all the other religions that were in the Roman Empire, except for the Jewish, interestingly. They were identified as Jews. They had the same moral standards as the Jews.
Right.
But the Jews themselves didn't cast people out who didn't live up to the commandments.
Yeah, there's corrective counsel, but yeah.
There was discipline, and
Yeah.
there was discipline in the early church. But interestingly, they've cited Acts here in this first paragraph. Acts, the way, they were called Christians. So there's the two names they bore. The way, that's what they tended to call themselves, and Christians, well, that seems to be what the world called them, right?
Yeah.
Which shows what the name was that was prominent.
Yeah.
And yet, in this paragraph 1, what are they called again? The first century witnesses of Jehovah.
Yeah. You don't find that in the New Testament.
Never.
That expression.
So we'll put in two links. One is to C.S. Lewis, his discussion of the difference between agape love and all other types of love in the ancient world, because he analyzes the Greek uses, the Greek words that are generally translated love and affection in the New Testament. And the discussion of agape will link. Also, the historian, the social historian Rodney Stark's discussion of the difference between Christian love and how it showed up even in the 3rd century when pandemic broke out in the Roman Empire. The love of Christians overflowed. It was almost as if they couldn't love their brethren enough, that they had too much love, and it flowed out into the Roman Empire and blessed people who were not part of the church.
Yeah.
So Rodney Stark did, I think we've done 4 videos on it, which are linked together.
It bore good testimony.
It was a fantastic testimony, because even the Roman emperor himself took note of it. So I think it's the 3rd or the 4th video in this series, which are linked together. But we'll put the first one on your screen. In the 3rd or 4th, the emperor, Julian, so-called the apostate, Julian the Apostate, comments upon the difference between the other religions and Christianity.
Right.
And though he doesn't want to become a Christian, he has to mark the difference. See you next time.